The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital buzzed overhead as I made my way down the long corridor of the emergency ward. It was hour 14 of my 16-hour shift, and the weight of fatigue pressed heavily on my shoulders. As a nurse, I was used to long hours and the emotional toll of caring for others, but nothing could have prepared me for what was about to unfold. My name is Sarah, and I've been working at St. Mary's for the past 5 years. It's a job I've always loved, despite its challenges. The satisfaction of helping others, of being there during their most vulnerable moments, has always outweighed the exhaustion and stress. But today, everything was about to change. I had just finished checking on Mr. Johnson, an elderly patient recovering from a hip replacement, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Normally, I wouldn't answer during a shift, but something told me this call was important. Ducking into a quiet corner near the nurse's station, I fished out my phone and saw my mother-in-law's name flashing on the screen. Linda, my husband Mark's mother, had never been my biggest fan. From the day Mark and I started dating, she'd made it clear that she didn't think I was good enough for her son. Over the years, we'd maintained a cordial but distant relationship, mainly for Mark's sake. So, receiving a call from her during my shift was unusual, to say the least. With a sense of trepidation, I answered the call. "Hello, Linda?" Her voice, cold and sharp, cut through the background noise of the hospital. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important." I glanced at my watch, aware that I needed to get back to my rounds. "Linda, I'm at work right now. Can this wait until dash?" She cut me off, her words hitting me like a physical blow. "Your husband doesn't want you here anymore." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. The bustling sounds of the hospital seemed to fade away, leaving me in a bubble of disbelief. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Linda continued, her voice dripping with a mix of triumph and disdain. "Mark's finally come to his senses. He doesn't want you in his life anymore. It's time for you to leave." I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly feeling weak. "I don't understand. Why isn't Mark telling me this himself?" Linda scoffed. "He didn't want to deal with your dramatics. That's why he asked me to tell you. Your things will be packed when you get home. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." As Linda's words sank in, a storm of emotions surged within me. Anger, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal intermingled as I struggled to maintain my composure. Every word she had uttered seemed calculated to inflict as much pain as possible, and yet there was a curious calmness in my reaction that even surprised me. Perhaps it was the shock, or maybe it was the years of dealing with difficult situations as a nurse, but I found myself responding with an eerie tranquility. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Linda sounded taken aback, clearly expecting a more dramatic reaction. "That's all you have to say?" I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady. "What else is there to say, Linda? If this is truly what Mark wants, then I'll respect his decision. But I think I deserve to hear it from him directly." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought I detected a hint of uncertainty in Linda's voice. "Well, as I said, he doesn't want to deal with you directly. Just make sure you're out of the house by the end of the week." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. My marriage, my home, my life as I knew it, all of it had just been upended in the span of a 2-minute phone call. As I lowered my phone, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened window of an empty patient room. I looked pale, shocked, but there was something else in my eyes, a glimmer of determination that I hadn't expected to see. It was in that moment that I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was, in fact, the beginning of a transformation I had long yearned for, even if I hadn't known it until now. The calm I felt wasn't acceptance. It was the quiet commencement of a plan that would soon reclaim my dignity and independence. I straightened my scrubs, took a deep breath, and headed back to the nurse's station. There were still patients who needed me, still 2 hours left in my shift. I couldn't let my personal life interfere with my responsibilities here. But with each step, each interaction with a patient or colleague, I felt a new resolve building within me. As I finished my rounds, checking IVs and administering medications, my mind raced with questions. How long had Mark been planning this? Was Linda telling the truth, Or was this some kind of cruel manipulation on her part? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? By the time I clocked out at the end of my shift, the shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a simmering anger and determination. I wasn't going to let Linda or Mark dictate the terms of my life. If this was truly the end of my marriage, I would face it head-on, with dignity and strength. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, I realized that this ultimatum, as painful as it was, might be the push I needed to rediscover myself. For too long, I had allowed myself to be defined by my roles: nurse, wife, daughter-in-law. Now, faced with the loss of one of those identities, I had the opportunity to redefine who I was and what I wanted from life. The familiar sight of Mark's house came into view as I turned onto our street. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow that seemed to mock the coldness I felt inside. As I parked in the driveway, I steeled myself for what I might find inside. Little did I know, the shocking ultimatum delivered by Linda was just the beginning. The true test of my resilience and the full extent of the betrayal were yet to be revealed. But as I stepped out of my car and walked towards the front door, I felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Whatever lay ahead, I was determined to face it with the same strength and compassion I brought to my work every day. The key turned in the lock, and I stepped into what had once been my home, ready to confront whatever awaited me on the other side of that door. As I stepped into the house, the silence hit me like a physical force. After a 16-hour shift at the hospital, I was used to coming home to the comforting sounds of life, the TV murmuring in the background, Mark wrestling in the kitchen, or even just the quiet hum of our old refrigerator. But tonight, there was nothing. The silence clung to every corner, amplifying the hollow feeling in my chest. I flicked on the light switch, and that's when I saw them. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes darted from one to another. Cameras. Small, sleek, and unmistakably new, they were positioned strategically around our living room. One on the bookshelf, another tucked in the corner by the window, a third mounted discreetly above the TV. Each lens seemed to stare back at me, silent witnesses to the unraveling of my life. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. When had these been installed? Why? The weight of Linda's words from our earlier phone call pressed down on me. Was this Mark's doing? Or had Linda taken matters into her own hands? I moved further into the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Everything looked the same, and yet entirely different. The family photos on the wall, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock me. There was Mark and me on our wedding day, his arm around my waist, both of us beaming at the camera. Had he been planning this even then? As I reached the kitchen, my eyes fell on a note stuck to the fridge. My heart leaped, thinking it might be from Mark, an explanation, an apology, anything. But as I got closer, I recognized Linda's neat, precise handwriting. "Sarah, as discussed, you need to be out by the end of the week. Don't take anything that isn't explicitly yours. The cameras are there to ensure you comply." Linda, the note crumpled in my fist as a wave of anger washed over me. How dare she? This was my home, my life. And now she was treating me like a criminal, monitoring my every move. I stormed towards our bedroom, or what used to be our bedroom, determined to confront Mark. But as I reached for the doorknob, I froze. The lock was different. New, shiny, and very much locked. I jiggled the handle, disbelief turning to frustration as the reality sank in. I was locked out of my own bedroom. Leaning against the door, I slid to the floor, the events of the day finally catching up with me. The exhaustion from my shift, the shock of Linda's call, and now this. It was all too much. I buried my face in my hands, allowing myself a moment of weakness, a moment to let the tears flow. But as I sat there, something inside me shifted. The initial shock and hurt began to give way to a simmering anger, a determination I didn't know I possessed. I wiped my eyes and stood up, squaring my shoulders. If they thought they could push me out of my own life without a fight, they had another thing coming. I made my way back to the living room, eyeing the cameras warily. Then, an idea struck me. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the cameras, the new lock, Linda's note. If this was going to turn ugly, I needed evidence. As I documented the changes to my home, my mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. I needed legal advice, that much was clear. But more than that, I needed answers. Why was this happening? What had changed? I sank onto the couch, my body heavy with exhaustion, but my mind whirling. The Mark I knew, or thought I knew, would never do something like this. He was kind, considerate, always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. We'd had our rough patches, sure, but what couple didn't? Nothing that would warrant this. My eyes fell on a framed photo on the coffee table. It was from our trip to the beach last summer. Mark and I were laughing, sandy and sun-kissed, the ocean stretching out behind us. I picked up the frame, running my finger over Mark's smiling face. "What happened to us?" I whispered. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I heard footsteps approaching the front door. Was it Mark? Linda? I stood up, bracing myself for a confrontation. The door opened, and I found myself face to face with Tom, Mark's younger brother. He looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him. "Sarah," he said, his eyes darting around the room. "Hi, I didn't expect you to be here." Clearly, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "What are you doing here, Tom?" He shifted uncomfortably, not quite meeting my eyes. "I'm just here to pick up some of Mark's things. He's staying with me for a while." The confirmation that Mark had indeed left hit me like a punch to the gut. "So it's true then," I said quietly. "He's really leaving me." Tom's face softened with what looked like genuine sympathy. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." "I don't know all the details, but yeah, it looks that way." I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my composure. "And the cameras? The new locks? Was that your idea too?" Tom's eyes widened as he noticed the cameras for the first time. "What?" "No, I had no idea about any of that. That must have been Mom's doing." "Of course it was. Linda's fingerprints were all over this." "Tom," I said, my voice low and urgent, "please, can you tell me what's going on? Why is Mark doing this?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know all the details, Sarah. Mark's been different lately. Distant. He showed up at my place a few days ago, said he needed some time away. I thought you guys were just going through a rough patch." I laughed bitterly. A rough patch. That's one way to put it. Tom looked at me, his expression a mix of pity and guilt. "Look, I know it's not my place, but maybe this is for the best? Mark's been unhappy for a while now. Maybe you both need some time apart to figure things out." His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. Had I been so caught up in my work, in the day-to-day grind, that I'd missed the signs of Mark's unhappiness? "Thanks for your honesty, Tom," I said quietly. Can you tell Mark I'd like to talk to him? When he's ready." Tom nodded, looking relieved to have something concrete to do. "Sure, I can do that. Take care of yourself, Sarah." As he left with a duffel bag of Mark's belongings, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a grim determination. I may have been blindsided by this betrayal, but I wasn't going to let it define me. I spent the rest of the evening making calls to a lawyer, to my closest friend Jenny, to my supervisor at the hospital to request some personal days. With each call, each step of my hastily formed plan, I felt more in control. As I settled onto the couch for the night, unable to face sleeping in the guest room, I found myself staring at the cameras again. They no longer seemed threatening. Instead, they were a reminder of the path ahead of me, a path that would require strength, resilience, and a willingness to fight for myself. Tomorrow, I decided I would start reclaiming my life. I would face Linda, confront Mark, and most importantly, rediscover the woman I was beneath the roles of wife and nurse. As I drifted off to sleep, exhausted but resolute, I realized that this betrayal, painful as it was, might just be the catalyst for the change I'd been needing all along. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal battles, emotional confrontations, and moments of self-doubt. But as I closed my eyes, I felt a flicker of hope. Whatever happened, I would face it head-on, with the same strength and compassion that had carried me through countless challenging shifts at the hospital. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The first rays of sunlight crept through the living room curtains, gently rousing me from a fitful sleep on the couch. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot where I was and why I was there. Then, as consciousness fully took hold, the events of the previous day came crashing back. The cold metal of the new door lock seemed to press against my skin, even though I hadn't moved from my makeshift bed. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the uncomfortable sleeping position and the emotional toll of the past 24 hours. The house was quiet, almost unnaturally so. It was a Saturday, and normally Mark and I would be bustling about, making breakfast, planning our weekend. Now, the silence was deafening. My eyes were drawn to the cameras scattered around the room. In the soft morning light, they seemed even more intrusive, their lenses glinting as if they were alive, watching my every move. I felt a surge of anger rise within me. This was my home too. How do they make me feel like an intruder in my own space? With a determined sigh, I pushed myself off the couch and made my way to the kitchen. The simple act of making coffee felt like a small victory, a reminder that I could still function, still take care of myself despite the upheaval in my life. As the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, I leaned against the counter, letting my mind wander. Memories flooded back, unbidden and bittersweet. I remembered the day Mark and I had moved into this house 5 years ago. We had been so full of hope, so excited about starting our life together. I could almost hear the echo of our laughter as we unpacked boxes, playfully arguing about where to put the furniture. Then there was the housewarming party we'd thrown a month later. Our friends and family had crowded into this very kitchen, the air filled with the clinking of glasses and the warmth of good company. Linda had been there too, I recalled with a pang. She'd brought a casserole and a forced smile, her disapproval of me barely concealed beneath a veneer of politeness. The coffee maker beeped, jolting me back to the present. I poured myself a cup, the familiar routine providing a small comfort. As I sipped the hot liquid, I found myself drawn to the refrigerator. The family photos and mementos that had once covered its surface were gone, leaving behind only faint outlines where they had once been. Another small cruelty, another reminder of my new reality. I made my way back to the living room, coffee in hand. Settling into the armchair, Mark's favorite spot, I let my gaze wander around the room. Every object, every piece of furniture held a memory. The bookshelf in the corner, filled with a mishmash of my medical textbooks and Mark's sci-fi novels. The throw pillows on the couch, a wedding gift from my best friend Jenny. The painting above the fireplace, a piece we'd bought together on our honeymoon in Italy. It all looked the same, and yet everything had changed. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison, the familiar surroundings a cruel reminder of what I had lost. The weight of abandonment pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. How had we gotten here? When had Mark's love for me turned to, whatever this was? Had I been so blind, so caught up in my work at the hospital that I'd missed the signs of our failing marriage? A knock at the door startled me out of my reverie. For a moment, my heart leaped. Could it be Mark? Had he come to his senses, ready to talk things through? But as I approached the door, I saw through the peephole that it was Jenny, her face etched with concern. I opened the door, and without a word, Jenny enveloped me in a tight hug. It was only then, in the arms of my oldest friend, that I finally let myself break down. The tears I'd been holding back since Linda's phone call came in a flood, my body shaking with sobs. Jenny guided me back to the couch, her arm around my shoulders. "Oh, Sarah," she murmured, "I'm so sorry." When I had finally cried myself out, Jenny went to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water and a box of tissues. As I sipped the water, trying to compose myself, Jenny's eyes darted around the room, taking in the cameras and the changed locks. "This is insane," she said, her voice tight with anger. "They can't do this to you. It's your home too." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. Jenny had been my friend since college, had been my maid of honor at my wedding to Mark. She knew me better than anyone, and I could see the mixture of concern and fury in her eyes. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" she asked, her practical nature taking over. I called one yesterday, I replied, my voice hoarse from crying. I have an appointment on Monday. Jenny nodded approvingly. Good. You need to fight this, Sarah. Don't let them push you around. Her words stirred something in me, a spark of the determination I'd felt the night before. I won't, I said, surprised by the strength in my voice. This isn't over. We spent the rest of the morning talking, Jenny's presence a balm to my wounded spirit. She helped me make a list of things I needed to do, calling my parents, gathering important documents, looking for a temporary place to stay. With each item we ticked off, I felt a little more in control, a little more like myself. As Jenny was leaving, she paused at the door. You know, she said, her eyes serious, maybe this is an opportunity. You've always put everyone else first. Mark, your patients, even Linda. Maybe it's time you focused on yourself for a change. Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone. As I moved around the house, gathering the things I'd need for the next few days, I found myself thinking about who I was outside of my roles as wife and nurse. What did I want for myself? What dreams had I put aside in the name of compromise and keeping the peace? The afternoon wore on, the house growing dim as the sun began to set. I found myself back in the living room, staring at the cameras that seemed to mock my pain. In a sudden burst of defiance, I grabbed a throw blanket from the couch and draped it over the nearest camera. It was a small act of rebellion, but it made me feel better. As I stood there, looking at the covered camera, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of abandonment was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was joined by something else, a growing sense of possibility. Yes, my marriage might be over. Yes, the life I had built with Mark was crumbling around me. But I was still here. Still standing. Still capable of rebuilding. I thought about the patients I'd cared for over the years, the ones who had faced unimaginable challenges with grace and courage. If they could do it, so could I. I was Sarah Thompson, after all. I had worked my way through nursing school, had held the hands of the dying, had brought new life into the world. I was stronger than this betrayal. As night fell, I made my way to the guest room, unable to face another night on the couch. The room was sparsely furnished, impersonal, but it was blessedly free of cameras. As I lay in bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I made a promise to myself. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back. I would reclaim my home, my dignity, and my sense of self. I would face Linda's manipulations and Mark's abandonment head-on. And no matter what happened, I would emerge from this stronger than before. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew. There would be legal battles, emotional confrontations, and moments of doubt. But as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was the author of my own destiny. And with that thought, I closed my eyes, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in days. The weight of abandonment was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a growing determination. As I went through my morning routine, I couldn't help but feel like I was preparing for battle. First things first, documentation. I grabbed my phone and started methodically photographing every change in the house. The new locks, the cameras, Linda's note. Everything was captured and time-stamped. As I moved from room to room, I felt less like a victim and more like a detective, gathering evidence for a case I was determined to win. Next, I sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad and started listing out everything I needed to do. It was a long list, intimidating in its scope, but having it all written down made it feel more manageable. 1. Meet with the lawyer. 2. Find a temporary place to stay. 3. Gather important documents. 4. Contact the bank about joint accounts. 5. Inform work about the situation. 6. Research tenant rights. As I wrote, I realized how much of my life was intertwined with Mark's. Our finances, our friends, even our daily routines, everything would need to be untangled. It was daunting, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in years, I was making decisions solely for myself. I decided to start with the most pressing issue, finding a place to stay. As much as I hated the idea of leaving my home, I knew I couldn't stay here indefinitely, not with Linda's ultimatum hanging over my head. I called Jenny, who immediately offered her spare room. "Stay as long as you need," she insisted. "We'll figure this out together." Her support brought tears to my eyes. In the midst of all this chaos, it was comforting to know I wasn't alone. With that settled, I turned my attention to gathering important documents. Birth certificate, marriage license, financial records. I collected them all, scanning each one with a mobile app Jenny had recommended. "Always have a backup," she'd said, and I was grateful for her foresight. As I was going through our filing cabinet, I came across a folder I didn't recognize. Curious, I opened it and felt my heart drop. Inside were bank statements for an account I'd never seen before, dating back several months. The transactions were vague, but the amounts were substantial. Was this why Mark had been so distant lately? What was he hiding? I added, "investigate suspicious account," to my growing to-do list, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. One problem at a time, I reminded myself. By early afternoon, I felt like I'd made good progress. I'd informed my supervisor at the hospital about my situation, and she'd been surprisingly understanding, offering me a week of personal leave to sort things out. I'd also left a message with a tenant rights organization, hoping they could advise me on my legal standing in the house. As I was about to start researching divorce lawyers, a task that made my heart ache, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Tom, Mark's brother. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about all this. Can we meet? There's something you should know." I stared at the message, my mind racing. What could Tom possibly have to tell me? Was it about Mark? About Linda? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to focus on my plan, but I knew I couldn't. Any information could be crucial at this point. I agreed to meet Tom at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where we could talk without the oppressive presence of the cameras in the house. As I drove there, I couldn't help but feel a mix of hope and dread. What revelations awaited me? The coffee shop was busy, filled with the weekend crowd. I spotted Tom in a corner booth, looking uncomfortable and out of place. As I slid into the seat across from him, I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, his voice low. I don't know where to start. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The beginning is usually a good place. Tom nodded, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "It's about Mark and Mom. There's something you need to know." For the next hour, Tom poured out a story that left me reeling. He told me about Linda's long-standing manipulations, her subtle attempts to drive a wedge between Mark and me. He spoke of overheard conversations, of Linda's whispered insinuations about my devotion to my job, about the possibility of other men. "I should have said something sooner," Tom said, his voice thick with regret. I didn't want to believe it. Mom's always been controlling, but this is something else. I sat there, trying to process it all. Part of me wanted to be angry at Tom for not speaking up sooner, but I could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. And hadn't I been blind to it all too? What about Mark? I asked, dreading the answer. How much of this is his idea? Tom shook his head. I don't know. He's been different lately. Withdrawn. I think Mom's gotten into his head, but I don't know how much he's actively participating in all this. As I drove home, my mind was whirling with this new information. It changed things, but I wasn't sure how yet. I needed time to think, to adjust my plan. Back at the house, I sat down at the kitchen table, my notepad in front of me. I stared at my to-do list, then flipped to a new page. At the top, I wrote, "Questions to answer," in bold letters. 1. What does Mark really want? 2. How deep does Linda's manipulation go? 3. What are my rights in this situation? 4. What do I want for my future? That last question gave me pause. In all the chaos of the past few days, I hadn't really stopped to consider what I wanted. Not just in terms of the house or the marriage, but for my life going forward. I thought about my job at the hospital, the satisfaction I felt when I helped a patient. I thought about the dreams I'd put on hold, traveling, maybe going back to school for an advanced degree. I thought about the kind of relationship I wanted, one built on trust and mutual respect. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen, I felt a shift in my perspective. Yes, this situation was painful and unfair. But it was also an opportunity. An opportunity to reassess, to rebuild, to create a life that truly reflected who I was and what I wanted. I added one more item to my to-do list: rediscover Sarah. That night, as I packed a bag to take to Jenny's, I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness at leaving my home, even temporarily. Anger at the circumstances that had led to this. But also, surprisingly, a glimmer of excitement. The future was uncertain, but it was also full of possibilities. As I took one last look around the house, my eyes fell on the cameras. In a sudden burst of defiance, I turned to the nearest one and spoke clearly. "I don't know if you're watching this, Linda, or you, Mark. But I want you to know I'm not backing down. This isn't over." With that, I walked out the door, my head held high. The plan was just beginning to form, but one thing was clear: I was taking control of my own story. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. As I drove to Jenny's house, the weight of the past few days still pressed on me, but it was balanced now by a sense of purpose. I had a long road ahead, filled with legal battles, emotional confrontations, and difficult decisions. But I also had something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was the author. And I was determined to make it a good one. A week had passed since I'd left the house, and I felt like I'd lived a lifetime in those 7 days. I'd met with a lawyer, started the process of separating our finances, and even begun looking for a small apartment of my own. But there was one confrontation I'd been putting off, one that I knew I couldn't avoid any longer. It was time to face Linda. I'd arranged to meet her at a small cafe downtown, a place neutral enough that neither of us would have the home field advantage. As I sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, I ran through the conversation in my head for what felt like the 100th time. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Linda walk in. She looked immaculate as always, her gray hair perfectly coiffed, her clothes expensive and tasteful. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that I'd never seen before. "Sarah," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I'm surprised you wanted to meet." I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "We need to talk, Linda, about everything that's happened." She waved a hand dismissively. "I think we've said all that needs to be said. You need to accept that your marriage is over and move on." "No," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "We haven't said nearly enough. I want to know why. Why did you do this? Why did you turn Mark against me?" Linda's eyes widened slightly, a crack in her usually impenetrable facade. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mark made his own decisions." "Did he?" I leaned forward, my voice low but intense. "Or did you make them for him, like you've been doing his entire life?" For a moment, Linda looked genuinely taken aback. Then her expression hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about. I've only ever wanted what's best for my son. And you decided that wasn't me?" The hurt in my voice was palpable, even to my own ears. Linda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched coffee cup. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "You don't understand what it's like. To watch your child struggle, to see them settle for less than they deserve." I felt a flash of anger. "Settle? Is that what you think our marriage was?" "Mark had so much potential," Linda continued, as if she hadn't heard me. "He could have been a doctor, a lawyer. But he was content to stay in his safe, small job. And you were always so focused on your career. I thought you'd push him to be more, but instead, I loved him for who he was." I finished, realization dawning. "Not for who you wanted him to be." Linda's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw the pain there. The disappointment, the fear. "I just wanted him to be happy," she said softly. "And you thought breaking up our marriage would accomplish that?" I asked, incredulous. Linda shook her head. I thought if he could see that you weren't right for him, he'd finally start living up to his potential. That he'd become the man I always knew he could be." I sat back, trying to process this. All the manipulation, all the pain she'd caused, and it all came down to her own unfulfilled expectations for her son. It was almost tragically absurd. "Linda," I said, my voice gentler now, "did you ever consider that maybe Mark was already happy? That maybe the life he chose, the life we built together, was exactly what he wanted?" She looked away, and I saw a tear glisten in the corner of her eye. "I just wanted what was best for him," she repeated, but her voice lacked conviction. "And what about what Mark wants?" I pressed. "Have you ever asked him? Really listened to him?" Linda was silent, and I could see the conflict playing out on her face. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of pity for her. How lonely must she be, how unfulfilled, to pin all her hopes and dreams on her son. "I love Mark," I said softly. "Not for what he could be, or what I want him to be, but for who he is. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Linda opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. For once, she seemed at a loss for words. Just then, the bell above the door chimed again. We both looked up, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Mark was standing there, his eyes moving from me to his mother and back again. "Tom told me you'd be here," he said, his voice uncertain. I think we need to talk." Linda stood up abruptly. "Mark, darling, I can explain everything." But Mark held up a hand, silencing her. "No, Mom. I've heard enough explanations. I need to talk to Sarah. Alone." Linda looked like she wanted to protest, but something in Mark's expression stopped her. With a last, conflicted look at both of us, she gathered her purse and left the cafe. Mark slid into the seat she had vacated, his eyes never leaving mine. "Sarah," he began, "I am so sorry." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Mark, why? Why did you let this happen?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "I was weak," he said simply. "I let Mom get into my head, make me doubt everything. Our marriage, your love for me, even my own worth. But why didn't you talk to me?" I asked, fighting back tears. "We could have faced this together." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I know. I should have. But Mom, she's always had this way of making me feel like I'm not enough. Like I need to be more, do more. And somehow, she convinced me that you felt the same way." I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "Mark, I have never wanted you to be anything other than who you are. I love you, just as you are." He squeezed my hand, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I know that now. Tom, he told me everything. About Mom's manipulations, about how she'd been trying to drive us apart. I couldn't believe it at first, but then I started thinking about everything that's happened, and it all made sense." We sat there for a long time, talking through everything that had happened. Mark told me about his mother's subtle comments, her insinuations about my dedication to my job, her constant pushing for him to be more. I shared my own experiences, the hurt and confusion of the past weeks. As we talked, I felt something shift between us. The wall of misunderstanding and hurt that had built up began to crumble. It wasn't a magical fix. We both knew we had a lot of work to do to rebuild the trust that had been broken. But it was a start. "What do we do now?" I asked finally, as the cafe began to empty around us. Mark looked at me, his eyes serious. "I want to try again if you'll have me. I want to be better, to communicate more. And I want to set some boundaries with my mother." I nodded slowly. "It won't be easy," I warned. "We've both been hurt. It's going to take time to heal." "I know," he said. "But you're worth it. We're worth it." As we left the cafe, hand in hand, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally out, hope for our future, and a lingering sadness for the pain we'd both endured. But most of all, I felt stronger. We'd faced this challenge, and while it had nearly broken us, we'd come through it together. The confrontation with Linda had revealed more than I'd expected. It had shown me the deep-seated insecurities and fears that had driven her actions. It had exposed the cracks in Mark's relationship with his mother, cracks that would need to be addressed if we were to move forward. But it had also revealed the strength of our love, a love that had weathered a storm that would have broken many couples. As we walked down the street, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The road to healing would be long, but for the first time in weeks, I felt truly hopeful. This wasn't just an ending of a difficult chapter, but the beginning of a new one. A chapter where we were stronger, more honest, and more committed to each other than ever before. As we reached our car, Mark turned to me. "Sarah," he said softly, "thank you for not giving up on us." I smiled, feeling tears prick at my eyes. "Never," I replied. "We're in this together, remember?" And as we drove home, really home, to the house we'd built our life in, I knew that while the past weeks had been painful, they had also been transformative. We had been tested, pushed to our limits, but we had emerged stronger. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever it held, we would face it side by side. The weeks following the confrontation with Linda and the heart-to-heart with Mark were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. As I stood in our bedroom, my fingers tracing the edge of the new lock we'd installed together, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had shifted in such a short time. The first order of business had been reclaiming our space. Together, Mark and I had gone through the house, removing every last camera Linda had installed. It was a cathartic process, each camera we took down feeling like a small victory. When we were done, we stood in the living room, surrounded by the dismantled devices, and shared a look of triumph. "It's our home again," Mark had said, pulling me close. I nodded, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in weeks. "Yes, it is." But reclaiming our physical space was just the beginning. We both knew that the real work lay in rebuilding our relationship, in addressing the cracks that had allowed Linda's manipulation to take hold in the first place. We started seeing a couples therapist, Dr. Ramirez, who helped us navigate the complex emotions we were both dealing with. In those sessions, we learned to communicate more openly, to express our fears and insecurities without judgment. "Mark," I said during one particularly intense session, "I need you to understand how hurt I was when you didn't come to me with your doubts. When you let your mother's words come between us." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I've always struggled to stand up to my mom. But that's no excuse. I should have trusted in us, in you." Dr. Ramirez leaned forward. "And Sarah, how does hearing that make you feel?" I took a deep breath, fighting back tears. "It helps. But I'm scared. Scared that it could happen again, that we could let outside influences come between us." Mark reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise you it won't. I'm learning to set boundaries, to trust in myself and in us. We're in this together, remember." Those words became our mantra in the weeks that followed. We're in this together. We said it when we were tackling household chores, when we were discussing our future plans, when we were lying in bed at night, talking about our days. Slowly but surely, we began to rebuild. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, of old hurts resurfacing. But each time, we faced them head-on, together. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with Linda. After the confrontation at the cafe, she had retreated, clearly shaken by the revelation of her actions. But we knew we couldn't ignore the issue forever. It was Mark who finally suggested we invite her over for dinner. I was hesitant at first, the memory of her betrayal still fresh. But I could see how important it was to Mark to try and mend this relationship, so I agreed. The evening was tense, to say the least. Linda sat at our dining table, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. The confident, controlling woman I'd known seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who looked lost and afraid. "Mom," Mark began, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about what happened. About the way you've been trying to control my life, our life." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant to hurt you," she said softly. "Either of you. I wanted so much for you, Mark. I thought I knew what was best." I felt a pang of sympathy, despite everything. "Linda," I said, "we understand that you love Mark. But you have to let him live his own life, make his own choices. Including choosing me." She nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "I see that now. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of soul-searching. I'd like to try and make amends, if you'll let me. It wasn't an instant fix. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But it was a start. We set clear boundaries with Linda, made it clear that while we wanted her in our lives, it had to be on our terms. To her credit, she seemed to be making a genuine effort to change. As our home life began to stabilize, I turned my attention back to my career. The week of leave I'd taken from the hospital had given me time to reflect on what I wanted for my job. I realized that while I loved nursing, I'd been feeling stagnant for a while. "I'm thinking of going back to school," I told Mark one evening as we sat on our porch, watching the sunset. "To become a nurse practitioner. It's something I've always wanted to do, but I kept putting it off." Mark smiled, squeezing my hand. "I think that's a great idea. You'd be amazing at it." His support meant everything to me. It was a stark contrast to the doubts Linda had tried to sow about my career ambitions, and it reinforced my belief that Mark and I were on the right path. The next few months were busy as I applied to programs, studied for entrance exams, and continued to work full-time. But through it all, Mark was my rock. He quizzed me on medical terminology, brought me coffee during late-night study sessions, and never once complained about the time I was dedicating to this new goal. As summer turned to fall, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful day when Linda had delivered her ultimatum. The pain of that time hadn't disappeared entirely. I don't think it ever would, but it had transformed into something else. A kind of strength, a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. One crisp October evening, Mark and I decided to take a walk in the local park. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, the air crisp and invigorating. As we strolled hand in hand, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. "You know," Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I was thinking about everything that's happened. And as awful as it was at the time, I think it made us stronger." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It forced us to confront some hard truths. About ourselves, about our relationship. We could have let it break us, but instead, we chose to fight for us, Mark finished. He stopped walking and turned to face me, taking both my hands in his. "Sarah, I want you to know how grateful I am. For your strength, your forgiveness, your love. I don't know what I'd do without you." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they were tears of joy, of love. "We're in this together, remember?" I said, echoing our mantra. Mark smiled, pulling me close. "Always," he whispered. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms with the autumn leaves swirling around us, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But we had weathered the storm, had come out the other side stronger and more united than ever. The experience had taught me so much about the strength of love, about the importance of communication, about my own resilience. It had pushed me to pursue dreams I'd long ignored, had forced me to stand up for myself and what I believed in. In the end, Linda's ultimatum, meant to tear us apart, had instead become the catalyst for a profound transformation. It had sparked a rebirth, not just of our marriage, but of ourselves as individuals. We had faced our fears, confronted painful truths, and emerged stronger for it. As Mark and I walked home that evening, planning our future and dreaming of what lay ahead, I realized that this wasn't just an ending to a difficult chapter in our lives. It was the beginning of a new one, full of hope and possibility. Whatever challenges the future might hold, I knew we would face them together, stronger and more united than ever before. The sun was setting as we reached our house, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. As Mark unlocked the door, our door to our home, I felt a surge of gratitude. For the journey we'd been through, for the love we shared, and for the future we were building together. We stepped inside, leaving behind the ghosts of the past and embracing the promise of tomorrow. Our story wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. And I couldn't wait to see what the next chapter would bring.